Good evening. My name is Tran, and I'm a student project manager at the Clark Forum for Contemporary Issues at Dickinson College. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that Dickinson College is on the unceded land of the Susquehannock Nation. We acknowledge the many indigenous people that lived with these lands, as well as the thousands of indigenous children forced into the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in 1879 as part of the federal cultural eradication effort. On behalf of Dickinson College, the Clark Forum, and the Law and Policy Program, I would like to welcome you to tonight's Winfield C. Cook Constitution Day program, Democracy Stress Test, Analysis of Attempts to Overturn the 2020 Election Result. This program is part of the Clark Forum Leadership in an Age of Uncertainty series. The 2020 election was an unprecedented one in United States history. In many states, President Biden won by narrow margins, and his election results were further challenged by Trump's legal team through an onslaught of lawsuits. With social distancing becoming the norm in many states, the Trump campaign claimed that mail-in and absentee ballots created the potential for fraud. Trump also insisted to his supporters that the election was stolen from him, and planned to use Congress to object the certification of electoral results submitted by the states. These messages helped instigate the January 6th insurrection. In this evening program, the panelists will discuss and analyze the attempts made by Trump campaign to avert the 2020 election result. Being a student during the COVID-19 pandemic and amidst the 2020 election, I feel that it's important for us to reflect on this uncomfortable moment in history to better understand the attempt to undermine U.S. democracy and prevent future threats. I hope that tonight's event provides context for understanding this precarious moment in U.S. history. Mary McCord is Executive Director of the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection and a visiting professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center. Previously, she served as the Assistant Attorney General for the National Security at the U.S. Department of Justice, the Principal Deputy Assistant Attorney General for National Security, and as an Assistant U.S. Attorney at the U.S. Attorney Office for the District of Columbia. Her writings on domestic terrorism, unlawful militia activity, and public safety have been featured in prestigious publications such as the Washington Post, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Los Angeles Times, and The Atlantic. David Thornburg is a senior advisor who previously served as president and CEO of Committee of 70. Thornburg is also a nationally recognized civic entrepreneur who has led high-impact initiatives to promote economic development and good government in Pennsylvania. Prior to his time at Committee of 70, he was the executive director of the Fels Institute of Government at the University of Pennsylvania and executive director of the Economy League of Greater Philadelphia. Jonathan Weiner is the former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Law Enforcement, U.S. Special Envoy for Libya, and counsel to Senator John Kerry for 10 years, during which he worked extensively on election law legislation and policy. Awarded the two highest honors by the State Department for extraordinary service, he was recognized with his achievements that are virtually unprecedented for any single official. Recently, he has published articles on the legal and enforcement issues associated with the 2020 election in the Washington Spectator and Just Security. Furthermore, he co-hosts the podcast series Unconventional Threat, which has addressed the unusual threats that are currently posed to our democracy. To a large degree, this evening program was made possible by Keep Our Republic, a nonprofit organization whose mission is to discover, highlight, and help prevent an array of extraordinary threats to American democracy, strengthen democratic guardrails, and educate the public before it's too late. Their civic creed is let all citizens vote, let all votes be counted, let the count stand. Mary McCord and Jonathan Weiner are members of Keep Our Republic's Advisory Council. We would like to thank Ari Middleman of Keep Our Republic for reaching out and helping make this program possible. There will be a question and answer session immediately following the program, so please hold all questions until that time. The Clark Forum welcomes differences of opinions expressed politely, thoughtfully, and succinctly. Disruptive behavior or harassment of speakers, members of the Dickinson community, or audience members will not be tolerated. As a show of respect for our speakers and everyone in attendance, please stay until the end of the program, including the question and answer session. At this time, I ask you please silence all cell phones and other electronic devices. In the event of emergency, please know that handicap accessible exits are located on the west side of the building. And now, please join me in welcoming our guests.
Thank you, Bao, and thank you everyone here at Dickinson for inviting us. And I hope if others are out, they'll just come on in and feel free to come and get a seat. I really think this is a compelling title for tonight's program, Democracy Under Stress, because it certainly is under stress unlike any other time in my life. And I want to reflect a little bit back to 2020, and I want to also get to the point where we can talk about where we are right now. And I hope we can then have a good Q&A session after all of the speakers get a chance to share some of their thoughts. So 2020 was, of course, a year, not just the election, but it was a year unlike any of us probably have experienced in our lives. The seeds of Stop the Steal were planted long before the election, and they coincided with a real rise in political violence and threats of political violence across the country. I mean, starting, as you probably recall, in early 2020, we, of course, were hit with COVID-19, a pandemic that hasn't been seen in this country since before all of our lifetimes. And we first started really seeing political violence in opposition to emergency orders declared by governors of many different states in order to protect public safety. We saw heavily armed militias storming state houses in Lansing, Michigan, Boise, Idaho, Louisville, Kentucky, and elsewhere in forcible opposition to public safety measures. We saw later, we had, of course, the murder of George Floyd at the very end of May, spurring racial justice demonstrations, not just throughout this country, but throughout the world. And in response to that, we saw again an uptick in political violence and threats of political violence. We saw again armed militia, unlawful private militias, self-deploying out ostensibly to protect private property or protect, in some cases, statutes, Confederate statues and even statues of Spanish conquistadors in New Mexico, usurping the authority of law enforcement, arrogating it unto themselves and deciding when and under what circumstances they would deploy that lethal force. And it was deployed in Kenosha, Wisconsin. A vigilante who had joined up with an unlawful militia used his weapon to kill 2 people and seriously injure another. Now, regardless of what the verdict in that case was, he was there as part of an unlawful private militia that has no authority under federal or state law, that is not protected by the Second Amendment, and that is unlawful in every state. And if there's time, we can get back and I can drill down on that. As this is happening, the former president has got kind of a call and response relationship with these militia groups, other extremist groups, conspiracy theorists, and what ultimately became the Stop the Steal movement. During the pandemic, rather than condemning the actions of those who would use political violence against elected leaders, he was urging them on. You may remember his set of tweets in April of 2020. Liberate Michigan, liberate Minnesota, liberate Virginia, and protect your Second Amendment rights. Now, liberate is a term that is used to talk about liberating an occupied territory from an occupying force. So essentially what he was doing was calling the legitimate elected governments and governors of these states illegitimate, and that the citizenry needed to be liberated from that occupying force, that legitimately elected government. During racial justice demonstrations, as you may recall, there was widespread blame for any violence, destruction of property on what were called violent anarchists or Antifa, that were getting all the blame for any acts, and there were acts of destruction of property and there were acts of violence. But by and large, the statistics show that the vast majority of demonstrations across the country were entirely peaceful. We're talking about sometimes high school demonstrations in small towns, in rural areas. We're talking about massive demonstrations in urban areas. And in many of these places, in response to the president's rhetoric, a call would go out before a racial justice march that the militias and other concerned citizens needed to self-deploy in order to protect against these violent anarchists. And I started getting calls about this because I've litigated against unlawful militias. At Georgetown Law, not only do I teach there, but I also run a small public interest litigation, constitutional litigation shop within the law school. And we sued a bunch of white supremacist militias and other militias after Charlottesville's Unite the Right rally. And we used state anti-militia law to obtain court-ordered injunctions against their unlawful usurpation of law enforcement and their unlawful offensive use of force and projection of use of force against counter-protesters. So I started getting calls in 2020. I got calls from high school students in Sandpoint, Idaho, and in rural Virginia saying, we just tried to have a Black Lives Matter march across a bridge, and there were armed men at every intersection with AR-15s. Can they do that? No, they can't do that, but they did. And they often did that in the former president's name. Now you may say, okay, what does this have to do with the election? Well, it was all of a piece, because even before November 3rd, we saw again the seeds of Stop the Steal being planted. As early as April, we had the former president tweeting essentially that if he didn't win, it was because of a rigged election. He was spreading baseless propaganda that mail-in ballots were highly susceptible to fraud, which is not demonstrated in any of the statistics. And in fact, the former president used mail-in and absentee ballots for many, many elections before he was the president. There was other, just disinformation, outright lies being spread about the vulnerability of our election systems, about using drop boxes for ballot collection, about allowing people to collect multiple ballots from those who couldn't go to the polls, about absentee ballots, all setting the seeds of saying, if I don't win, it's not because I didn't win, it's because there was fraud and the election was rigged. And of course, this spurred a number of efforts, even before the election, to diminish the ability for people to vote. I mean, you'll probably recall in Wisconsin, there were challenges to a district court that had extended, for pandemic reasons, extended the deadline for receiving absentee ballots and being able to count them. In North Carolina, there were challenges to the Board of Elections doing the same thing. There were challenges to the rules about having 2 witnesses to an absentee vote. And of course, here in Pennsylvania, a challenge to the state Supreme Court's interpretation of the state constitution, the Pennsylvania state constitution, that would allow the state to count ballots as long as they were postmarked before Election Day and received within 3 days thereafter. All of this flurry of activity of these lawsuits were egged on by much of the disinformation about fraud in the ballots, fraud in the election. And as we came closer to November 3rd, we started to see a confluence of all of these extremists, right? Militia violent extremists, conspiracy theorists, I'm talking about QAnon, accelerationist, white supremacist groups, I'm talking about groups like the Base and others that are agitating for a civil war so that they can create their own white ethno-state. We saw other white supremacist groups, and we saw just, this amalgamation of those who had discrete and separate ideologies, but came together in order to coalesce around Stop the Steal. And of course, this all just got doubled down on after the election, right? After the election, the rhetoric and the disinformation became even greater. We saw bogus, frivolous lawsuits being filed across the country, but primarily in swing states where the former president was contesting the election results. So many lawsuits, so frivolous that really only one was not thrown out of court by state judges, by federal judges, appointed by Republicans, appointed by Democrats, elected by their constituents, all throwing out lawsuits because they lacked any basis in fact. We saw partisan-driven audits, which were demanded in states even apart from the rules that normally govern when audits can be sought. All of which that have been conducted so far have even come out saying there was no fraud in the election, but that didn't stop the constant and incessant pounding and requesting for those audits. We saw a delay in the presidential transition. Under the Presidential Transition Act, the GSA director of the General Services Administration is responsible by law for ascertaining the winner and then providing things like office space and equipment and resources to the incoming president so that you can have a smooth transition. I was in the government for a quarter of a century. I went through many transitions. It's necessary to be able to smoothly transition between an outgoing administration and an incoming administration, but she delayed it. She refused to ascertain because the former president had not yet conceded the election, and of course still hasn't conceded the election. But perhaps worse than all of these things, we had coercion, threats, and intimidation of our election officials. From the former president calling Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger and trying to coerce him into finding 11,000 votes that would have made Trump the winner of Georgia, to threats to other secretaries of state, not only by the former president, but by individuals and extremists, sending, online threats, showing up at homes, following children, threatening family members. We had coercion of local elected officials, attempts to urge them through threats and coercion to not certify the actual legitimate results. Now, the results held because of the integrity of so many of those people at so many places along the way. From the voters who, despite all of the efforts to restrict their opportunities, voted, whether it was mail-in, whether it was standing for 6-8 hours in line on election day. Local election officials who resisted the coercion brought upon them, sometimes with calls from the former president himself, resisted the coercion to not certify and said, we see no fraud here, we're certifying. Secretaries of State who did the same thing. Vice President Mike Pence, who resisted the president's attempts to coerce him into, on January 6th, refusing to accept the electoral slates from the states to certify the election. And of course, to the law enforcement officers and National Guard members who protected the Capitol on January 6th from a violent invasion by a group of all of the extremists we've been talking about: militia violent extremists, conspiracy theorists, white supremacists, accelerationists, and people who legitimately had been swayed by the disinformation, people who came originally probably thinking they were going to protest and got swept up by the mob became the riot became violent, and I'm quite sure that a number of the people who ended up participating in that probably did not go to Washington, D.C. on January 6th intending to do that. Some did, and it was urged on by the former president. So we could spend the whole evening just rehashing all those things. At the end of the day, though, we did have a peaceful transition of power, despite the efforts to prevent it. We did have the duly elected president who got not only the Electoral College votes, but the popular vote, and that's the first time, and it was new from the previous election, got the popular vote, did get installed into office. And we thought, I think, that maybe we'd be able to move on. But it really hasn't been the case. And so what I want to raise for us to continue to have further discussion throughout the night is where we're at now. So now what we're seeing is again, those threats to election officials, they're quitting in droves. They're quitting in droves because it's not worth it to them and their families to have to put up with that kind of threats. And they're being replaced by election deniers. Steve Bannon and others actively recruiting election deniers to take those positions, even down to that local precinct level, the level that will be responsible for counting and certifying votes, that level that, and at the next level, the county boards of elections. But it goes higher than that. There are presently 21 people running for Secretary of State in 18 different states who deny that President Biden won the election. There are 11 election deniers running for Attorney General in 10 different states, and there are 51 election deniers running for governor in 24 states. So if we are successful in every piece of voting legislation that Congress has considered and states have considered, so that we get every eligible person to the polls in 2024, all that will be for naught if those in the positions responsible for certifying our elections and sending the proper and legitimate slate of electors to Congress to count, if they do not do their jobs the way those jobs were done in the past, we will have a crisis regardless of how many come out to vote. We've also seen legislatures trying to replace, through legislation, state legislatures, the authority of state election officials with persons that the state legislature chooses. We've seen legislation that would allow statewide boards and county commissions new authority to replace election officials. We've seen criminal penalties being enacted for very minor errors in election administration as an intimidation and chilling tactic to frighten those from taking those jobs. And we've even seen legislation that would allow for the state legislatures to overturn the popular vote in a state. And in Arizona, the pending bill is for really no reason at all. They just decide to overturn it. That is not only unconstitutional, but is completely un-American. It's undemocratic. I should say it's anti-democracy, because I hate to talk about this Democratic and Republican, because these issues, these are anti-democracy, and there are good people of both parties who believe that these measures are absolutely antithetical to the very foundations of our government. So, last points, accountability. What do we do to not have this happen? Accountability is important, and we are seeing some of it, but we need more. Of course, it's the largest Department of Justice investigation in history. I spent almost 25 years at the Department of Justice. The U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C. was my office. I was the criminal chief there before I became the Assistant Attorney General for National Security at Main Justice. And this investigation, 750 people have been charged related to the insurrectionist attack on the Capitol. That's some accountability, but there's more, because that's, for the most part, the people who were there on the ground. Where did it go up from there? Who were the players? Who were the masterminds? Who were pulling the strings? Who was financing it? Who was encouraging it? Who was enticing it or inciting it? For the attorneys who filed frivolous lawsuits, we're starting to see judges, Republicans and Democrats, sanctioning them for filing baseless lawsuits We're starting to see state bar examiners sanction and discipline lawyers for violating their professional ethics, because filing a baseless lawsuit is against your professional ethics. Each one of us as a lawyer must abide by those ethical rules. We are seeing some prosecution of those who threaten election officials, but not nearly enough. And we are seeing almost no consequences for those who propagate disinformation, whether it's through online platforms, whether it's the platforms themselves who are inadequately policing their platforms, whether it's news media who are being co-opted for political purposes. Very little there in the way of accountability. And so far, we have not seen accountability for the fraudulent electors who met in their states on the day designated for the electors of the winning candidate to meet and sent their fraudulent slates of electors up to Congress to certify. That accountability will be important for us to be able to move on and not have a repeat of what we've seen in the past. And with that, I will stop and hope to be able to answer questions later on this evening.
Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here with Mary and Jonathan and all of you. I've known of Dickinson by reputation and by lots and lots of your incredible graduates. This is my first time on campus, and it's really a pleasure to be here. I think my role in the lineup here is to focus a lot of the questions that Mary raised, and I think Jonathan will as well, onto this place we call Pennsylvania. Which is where I've spent most of my professional career, born and raised in Pittsburgh. I've lived in Philadelphia for about 30 years and spent endless hours going back and forth on the Turnpike. I think it is instructive to turn up the power of the lens a little bit on a state. It reveals some things and maybe softens some other things. I'm sometimes wary of national narratives that make sense maybe at 50,000 feet, but when brought down to the ground in particular states, maybe don't hold as true to the ground truth, as the military folks say. And Pennsylvania now is a consequential state. It certainly was in the 2020 elections, will be in 2024, and probably for the rest of my life will be a consequential election. So I wanted to treat this as a little bit of a case study, again, as to how these currents and cross currents are affecting this state and what has happened in the way of, I'll call them aftershocks of the 2020 election and how they have played out in Pennsylvania. Just a word about my view of Pennsylvania and its geopolitics. Again, born and raised here and know the state, I think, pretty well. I consider Pennsylvania to be kind of a quintessential center-left, center-right state. Sort of varies a little from maybe administration to administration or as the political winds come and go. You should know my father was Republican governor of Pennsylvania during the 80s, and I would consider him to be a solid center-right Republican, sadly of a type that is not as prominent as it once was. So that's one thing that tries to make some sense of Pennsylvania politically, but it's also worth remembering. We had dinner at the 1794 Whiskey Rebellion restaurant down the street, that Pennsylvania was the site of the first populist tax revolt in the country in 1794, when, of course, George Washington had to threaten the whiskey makers of Western Pennsylvania by taking his troops as far as Carlisle, which by that point they realized he was serious and they backed down. So there is a very populist, anti-tax, anti-government theme that's always been part of Pennsylvania politics. So I wanted to first start with a little bit of a recitation of some of the, we'll call them policy responses to the chaos, confusion, misinformation, disinformation, allegations surrounding the 2020 election. And Mary's absolutely right. that the drumbeat to encourage that kind of misinformation began not in 2020, but in 2016, when then candidate Trump decided that actually Philadelphia was the epicenter of all fraud, election fraud in the Commonwealth, despite the lack of any particularly persuasive evidence to that point. So we've been in the spotlight for a while. My sense, again, just a sort of a telling of what's happened since November 3rd, 2020, and some of you who are paying close attention to the political comings and goings in Harrisburg are maybe aware of a lot of this. There have been several different attempts to review and suggest changes to our election law and election security, beginning in the spring of 2021. Notably, the House of the Republican caucus in the General Assembly led an effort to do sort of a stem to stern review of election procedures, some very sort of logistical and others that had real consequences for who would turn out to vote and how they would vote. That resulted in a package of bills that was passed out of committee on a straight party ticket and taken to the House floor and passed on a straight party line vote, and taken to the Senate, passed on a straight party line vote, and then, not surprisingly, was vetoed by Governor Tom Wolf. Which, you know, call me old-fashioned, but I really do believe that changes to election law and other rules of the game ought to be done on a bipartisan basis or with a supermajority, because there's too consequential to allow one party to play out its game that way. So that was that. It's surfaced again from time to time. But I think as long as there's and I'll pick this up a little bit later, as long as there's a Democratic governor with a Republican General Assembly, that's just not going anywhere. You all probably also remember there was a surge of interest in an Arizona-style so-called quote audit that was championed by Senator Doug Mastriano, who was summarily removed from his position in leading that charge by the President of the Senate, Jake Corman, and that was passed on to Senator Chris Dush. And that effort, I think, was ultimately funded with appropriation from the legislature, and last I checked, will be playing out maybe a report to be delivered by May or sometime later this year. That to me feels like it's lost an awful lot of momentum and power, predictably, because I do believe there's really nothing to see. You know, along the way, another critical piece of the election infrastructure in Pennsylvania has been challenged, which is Act 77, which was passed, I remind folks, in October 2019 on a bipartisan vote that did allow for so-called no-excuse absentee balloting in Pennsylvania. Also did away with straight ticket voting. That was essentially the swap between the two parties. And that has been challenged in court. And I think I have this right, but the Commonwealth Court in Pennsylvania has ruled that, in its view, unconstitutional, pending a review by the Supreme Court a few weeks later. So there's more than a little uncertainty around that package of bills, but particularly the mail voting. Clearly, that is in the sights of the Republican members of the General Assembly. Also, and you've probably followed this, in this bitter partisan back and forth between the General Assembly and the governor, the General Assembly's also decided that they'll try an end around by invoking the possibility of proposing amendments to the state constitution, which you may know doesn't actually involve the governor at all. if you can get a majority vote in 2 successive sessions of the legislature, then it goes right to the people. And well, there have been a variety of proposals surfaced in that vein, and so far have not proceeded. But that is certainly worth taking, that old sense of eternal vigilance, because I think that's a profound misuse of the constitutional amendment process, and clearly is proceeding in that direction just to, as I said, to execute an end around the governor. Which maybe appropriately leads me to share with you some thoughts about the political lineup in Pennsylvania right now, and how those cross currents are affecting this whole process. It's very hard in Pennsylvania to talk about policy debates without crosswalking quickly into the political world, because this is a very political state. Everything we do in the election process, everything that we, the way we make decisions here is highly conditioned by partisan politics. We're one of the few states that don't allow independent voters to vote in primary elections, which I consider a real problem, and exacerbates things, and so on and so on. We're also one of the few states that has unlimited campaign contributions to statewide elections. As long as they're reported, you can write a $500,000 check or $1 million check or a $10 million check or what have you. So there's a lot of fuel for the partisan fires. Mary alluded to the fact our politics around, frame it as you will, election security issues or voter suppression or voter fraud have gotten all mixed up and jumbled with other issues around, masks and mandates and closures and who gets to decide in what way we do our best to keep Pennsylvanians safe. So it's hard to disentangle those threads, but it has been fierce. The political debates about all of these issues have been very fierce. There's a strong Republican majority in the state House, a lesser majority in the state Senate. But as I mentioned earlier, in some ways, Pennsylvania's situation so far is kind of a case study in the checks and balances that a divided government brings to these kinds of debates. The fact that we have a Republican legislature, but a Democratic governor and a Democratic Supreme Court means, it may mean gridlock, but it also provides, I think, a real level of protection against extremes and against extreme measures. That doesn't keep, the fires from burning and from sprouting up here and there. I will note, Mary's was talking about the number of secretaries of state that are up for election who are election deniers, and I said to her at dinner, fortunately, Pennsylvania doesn't have an elected secretary of state. It doesn't give us a safe harbor from those political wins, but on balance, I think we'd rather just as soon not have that be an elected position. Some of you political watchers know that today was a very consequential day in Pennsylvania politics, in that the Supreme Court chose a congressional map that we'll use for the next 10 years, which was the last stop in a long, long, long twisted and turning and winding road that had ample illustration of how fierce our partisan politics could be. And in my view, the fact that it ended up in the court is a real admission that the other branches of government failed in their duty, particularly the General Assembly, to whom this is, in fact, this is in their job description, but they have to work out a map that, that the governor will sign. And that didn't happen, so off to the court it went. But I think let's say all three branches of government are getting a lot of exercise these days, and often, and that's the way the system's designed, they're going to end up in court. And it is a shame. My organization has long been in favor of merit selection of appeals court justices in Pennsylvania, but we have elected justice. So inevitably, folks are going to look at that through a partisan lens. So if you buy that for the time being, this gridlock infused partisan balance is going to prevent extremes and extreme proposals from carrying forward, then where do we go from here? Because you may know that we're in the midst of a primary election season. Fun fact, this is the first primary in Pennsylvania's history where voters will vote on an open governor's seat, an open Senate seat, new state House maps, new state Senate maps, and new congressional maps. Never before in the history of Pennsylvania. So this is a huge, huge primary. You may have noticed that in the governor's race, there is one candidate on the Democratic side and about 12, 13, 14, it varies day to day, on the Republican side. In the Senate race, there's an equal pack of candidates on either side. I think these primary elections, both the Senate and the gubernatorial primaries, will be a true test of two things. One is the character and integrity of the candidates and of voters, and of their ability to come to terms with truth versus lies, and to find the true path and not be distracted by the misinformation and disinformation that is out there. It's also the true test of, I think, how significant the political base of a candidate can be in carrying that election. And we're vulnerable in this Commonwealth to a primary election where we have a lot of candidates. You have 12 candidates. Assuming everyone stayed in, you only need 1/12 of the vote plus one to win the primary. So you can win that with a small base of voters. Again, reminding you that we keep 1.1 million independent voters out of the process, so they can't play. And in fact, you may have seen the polls. One of the leading candidates in the governor's race is Senator Doug Mastriano, who has a very small but fervent base, but is polling 1, 2, or 3, depending on the polls that you see. And at the end of the day, that could be enough. You also probably know he is an election denier. He's also been subpoenaed by the January 6th committee. And there are lots of questions about his relationship to the Trump campaign and around January 6th. So this will be a true test. If we pass the test, and I like to be an optimist, if we pass the test, then it reasserts the will of the majority, and again could provide an effective check and balance against the kinds of extremes that Mary and others have talked about. I'll also point out that we head into this election with 2 improved maps, our state House and Senate maps and the congressional maps. They are much more balanced than the ones that they replaced. That was hard fought by some folks who were forced to stand up to partisan attacks. But the fact of the matter is we won that. And those are good maps. There is no such thing as a perfect map, but that gives me hope that this election will again reaffirm some important principles. The last thing I'll say, and I hope we can get into this in the conversation, I think we have to be actively thinking about the lines of defense that we can deploy in this process to maintain the integrity of something that we all cherish, which is the ability to vote and participate and to exercise our freedoms and responsibilities in this country. So this is a time when we all ought to be thinking about that, and I think your presence here suggests that you're up for the fight and for that. So thanks very much, and I look forward to hearing from Jonathan and the rest of the conversation.
You're going to hear a little bit more from me about the independent state legislature doctrine, but Pennsylvania needs to hear more from David about the independent voter doctrine, the Thornburg independent voter doctrine. I want to start with that because it fits into something that I wanted to begin with, which is John Rawls' theory of justice. When I was first studying politics and philosophy, my teacher said, I want you to just read this book. There's only one thing I really needed to remember from that book, and I've remembered it all these decades since, which was if you want to get a fair system, have the last person who's going to get the last slice of the pie be the one to divide up the pie. Use the last slice principle. So let's take the last slice principle and apply it to voting. If you're going to be the last person to have the vote counted, you're going to want to have every vote counted because otherwise yours isn't going to get counted at all. And if you think about that principle and stick with that principle all the way through the political system, you wind up with a system which is potentially fair. So we're talking today about the threats and the stresses to our system. And if you think about it, it begins with the threat to prevent people from voting. Shorten the amount of time people get to vote, make it harder for people to register to vote, independents to participate. For example, limit mail-in votes, put election monitors in place to challenge votes. These are the kinds of things you would do to prevent people from voting. It's a good way to try and increase the likelihood your side's going to win if you can go after the people on the other side with those kinds of limitations. The next threat is to the impartiality of the count. You want a fair count. You want every vote to be counted. If you start controlling the count by having people who are going to have their thumb on the scale, you can begin to potentially shape it to your side based on the fact that you get the thumb on the scale for the impartiality becoming the partiality of the count. You then say, okay, well, you know, there are courts out there, and courts have the principle of due process, which is in the Constitution. Due process is all about making laws to make everything equal, balanced, and fair. Equal protection is the same kind of idea. The laws apply to the people at exactly the same level across the board. So you limit the ability of the courts to provide that impartial function. You either make the courts partial, or you take them out of the equation entirely. You then might say, well, we're not sure that all that's going to be enough, so what we're going to do is we're going to, if we don't like the results of the vote, if the votes come out badly, we're going to change the rules after the vote in order to ensure that the side that we like wins. Now, if you're back at John Rawls' theory of justice, that would be a terrible idea. But it turns out that there is a theory relating to the Constitution which says that state legislatures shall determine how presidential electors are selected. And remember that in our country, it's not one man, one vote, or one person, one vote. For president, it's one state, certain amount of votes per state based on population. And under the Constitution, a state can say, well, the state legislature shall pick those electors, which is the way it was originally when we were first a country, or it can be done at the district level. Each congressional district can decide, still done that way in Maine and Nebraska, or the popular vote can decide across the board. And it turns out in the United States for a very long time, every single state has decided to adopt popular vote as the standard, either for the whole state or by congressional district, as I mentioned, which is the case in a couple of states. Well, under the independent state legislature doctrine, as it began to be advanced in 2020, I'm going to go back to that in a couple minutes after I go through the sequence, the idea is even after the election, if you don't like the result, you can say, nah, well, scratch that vote. It was marred by something I didn't like. Was it a dog barking? Was it the weather was bad that day? Was it the fact that there was too much traffic in some parts of the state? Was it the fact people were influenced by propaganda? I don't know. I don't have to say. Well, maybe I'll call it fraud. Now, why does fraud help so much? Because if it's fraud, you can say that we don't know what the real choice was of the voters. Since we don't know what the voters really chose, because so many of the ballots were fraudulent, we'll substitute our own view. And that's still due process, and that's still equal protection, because we can't determine who won the election. So that idea begins to intrude. And once you have that situation, Then it becomes ruled by whoever's got the majority in the particular swing states that are willing to act that ruthlessly. So much for a theory of justice, that becomes the practice of injustice. Now, what I just described, all of those threats sound kind of fanciful and fictional and unbelievable, but they all played out at one level or another in 2020, and they led to the insurrection. Now, when we look at the insurrection, why did the insurrection happen on January 6th? Well, as you may remember, President Trump said, "Come to Washington January 6th. It will be wild." Why did he say that? And why that date? Well, that was the date for the count. So from the beginning, it seems to anybody using logic and reason, maybe what was in President Trump's mind was to have them come to January 6th, the day of the count, that he knew he had lost on the basis of the votes that had been certified, in order to try and prevent the count from taking place, or to slow it down, to send it back to state legislatures to say, there was a steal, there was fraud, we're going to throw all that away, and we're going to send a different set of electors or certify a different set of electors. And just in case, by the way, President Trump and those associated with him, and there's more evidence still coming out about this, it appears organized people in the states, which included Pennsylvania, where his electors didn't win based on the counting of the popular vote, to send their votes into Washington anyway, as if they had won. It's never been done before on a nationwide basis. There's been one state that sent in Hawaii that sent in competing electors once. In this case, it was done on the same day, December 13th, 2020, in New Mexico, Nevada, Wisconsin, Michigan, Arizona, Georgia, I think I have the states right, and Pennsylvania, but there were seven. There were seven. All the same day, all meeting together, all in states where they had lost the popular vote. Well, somebody organized it. And why did they organize it? They organized it, as former President Trump said recently, because it would have given Mike Pence the chance to overturn the election results. By the way, the words overturn the election, this is not Mr. Weiner's words in this case, though I would have used them. This is Mr. Trump's words. He said aloud in a public forum. Pence could have overturned the election, he said. Now, the vice president doesn't actually have that authority under the Constitution. He only has the authority to open up the ballots and have them counted. But that was the former president's point of view. So the threat to our democracy, the stress tests of 2020, involved, as Mary outlined, and as David outlined, a series of things that happened to attack each element of the voting process. And in each case, including Georgia Republican Secretary of State Raffensperger's response, the elected officials responsible, the appointed officials responsible for doing all the things they were supposed to do, did the things they were supposed to do. Our democracy was stress tested in 2020, and it withstood the stress test. But then the insurrection took place, and that insurrection, luckily, was not effective enough, big enough, strong enough, violent enough to actually delay things long enough to allow a few other things to happen. I'm now going to tell you some things that are not generally known, but which there is evidence for that has come out. People associated with the former president drafted executive orders, at least one that's been made public now, whose text we've been able to see. We don't know how close it came to being acted on. But under the executive order, and we know more or less what day it was drafted, and we know that its contents were discussed, because that's all at this point public, even before the Select Committee has held its hearings. What they were going to do, proposed to do, was to invoke the president's emergency powers to seize all the voting apparatus in the United States that they wanted to, whatever they might want, all the votes that they might want, to decide which ones were clean and which ones were fraudulent, halt all counting and all other activity to allow them to be examined. And the person who was going to be in line to do this was Sidney Powell, the president's campaign lawyer, who would be in charge of the whole recount process. And then there was going to be an authorization given, according to this draft executive order. I want to emphasize, we don't know whether the president, it ever got to the president for his signature. We know its contents were discussed. To federalize the National Guard in order to take the ballots and the election machinery and put it under her control, and to deal with any civil unrest that might take place at the same time. Now, after the Jackson Square June 2016 activity in which there was the military came out to Washington, D.C., it's quite clear the U.S. military was not going to do this. It would have resisted it, but there was such a draft executive order combining a very dangerous thing, presidential emergency powers, with another very, very dangerous thing, which is the use of the military, to essentially take over our system and prevent a full count and the completion of peaceful transfer of power. Now, who got in the way of that? Why didn't that happen? Well, senior lawyers at the Justice Department, the acting Attorney General, the acting Deputy Attorney General, where Mary used to work, political appointees of Mr. Trump, Republicans, said, are you out of your minds? You're going to see a resignation from top to bottom if you do anything like this. They did this with related stuff, not exactly this executive order. We don't know how much of this executive order they were involved in. But you had people who were political appointees apply rule of law, impartial standards, and say this cannot be done. You had another person in the department, the acting number 3, who was absolutely ready to become its instrument and become acting Attorney General. His name was Jeffrey Bossert Clark, used to be an environmental lawyer who was opposed to all environmental legislation, more or less. That was how he cut his teeth in the Justice Department previously. In any case, it was a very close call. So where does that take us for 2024? Well, I'm going to go back to the theory of justice of John Rawls. It takes us to a situation in which we all have to act like we're going to be the last vote counted. And we should be judging our public officials on the basis of, are they applying principles neutrally to protect that last voter, to ensure that all votes are counted, that counts are voted impartially, and that the results are then abided to whatever they turn out to be. The principles of equal protection demand it. The principles of due process demand it. Mary's Constitutional Rights Center is going to continue to try and insist that those principles get enforced. They and others like them continue to win case after case after case because these principles are embedded in our entire system and they're essential for our future. But if you ask what can be done, the answer is apply those principles. Insist that those principles are applied. Insist that the independent voter doctrine determine elections rather than the independent legislature doctrine, which would be a recipe for the utter politicization of what has been for a very long time, a law-based and rule-based system. Thank you very much.
It is now time for the question and answer session. Because this event is being recorded, please wait for a microphone to reach you before asking your questions. We reserve the first questions for students, and then we will open up to the rest of the audience, and a reminder that masks are required. We will now take the first question.
Hi, first, thank you to all of you for being here tonight. I was wondering if you could go into depth about the powers of governor in regards to the outcome of elections, such as being able to appoint Secretary of State. And I was wondering, especially in regards to the fact that 2 of the people on the fake slate of electors for Pennsylvania are running for governor later this year.
I was looking at my notes after my remarks, and I had that noted. Look, I would put that into the framework of the test that this presents to voters in Pennsylvania. I happen to think that that is beyond offensive, that you could entertain the idea that you could be the governor of the Commonwealth having signed on to that kind of an offering. You know, if you followed that, they've said, well, we put a paragraph in there that said, this applies only if for some reason the other slate of electors falls short or is not counted or what have you, and that feels a little weak-teeth to me. So this is the kind of thing, you know, democracy works when people ask questions and learn things and share them with their friends and neighbors, and that to me is something that folks ought to take into account, and I think weigh very seriously. Your other question about the role of the governor, appointing the Secretary of the State is a very significant role. I honestly can't detail you the step-by-step nature of what up until now has been a formal, just a formalized process of accepting the slate of electors and certifying the count and so forth and so on. It is worth remembering, though, that in Pennsylvania, the Secretary of State plays, that the election counts are certified at the county level. And the job of the Secretary of State is essentially to accept the certification. They don't do like a recertification. So, you know, this is, I think has been referenced in other parts of our remarks, is that, you know, we count on the professionalism and integrity and the spirit in which those election officials carry out their jobs, as Mary, I think, pointed out, under great stress and really unfortunate stress these days. But I hope that answers your questions.
Loved all of your presentations. Mary, you spoke about accountability, and David, you spoke about what are the lines of defense. And I've got lots of thoughts circulating here about those 2 points. But I don't necessarily think that accountability is the answer. It's part of the answer. But Americans put bad people in office. And when I think about the problem underneath the problem, that is, how do we ensure that an American citizenry is not susceptible to the bad guys? I mean, I like that the Justice Department is completely focused on putting 700 people in jail. But we're talking millions of Americans, and what I'm not seeing out of Washington is talk on how we address the problem. And the problem is not getting people to vote. They're voting. I mean, yes, there are systematic problems, but the problems are that the real problem is that they're susceptible to disinformation. And, you know, it's like you're not locking your doors and you get robbed. We have to take some, I guess I wonder from you three, what your thinking is on how we address the real problem, which are the millions of people that put these folks in office.
Yeah, I certainly didn't mean to suggest accountability was a whole answer. You're absolutely right. I mean, it's an important piece, but it is just a piece. And I think you're getting at the real base question, which is the hardest question of all. Like, why are we in this position of us versus them? How do we get at the root causes of the polarization that we have? Because to my mind, everything that we saw culminating in Stop the Steal and now extending into election denial and all of these anti-democracy efforts is related to a bigger polarization that we're now seeing in debates over education and critical race theory and masking and, you know, so many things that go way beyond our, you know, right to go to the vote and exercise our constitutional rights to participate in our democracy. We're seeing people infringing other people's constitutional rights, other people's rights to speak freely, to peacefully assemble, to participate in their democratic processes. And the question is why? And I can analogize, as the Assistant Attorney General for National Security, I did a lot of work in counterterrorism, which was mostly international terrorism. 2014, when I became the Principal Deputy Assistant Attorney General, was a month before ISIS declared a caliphate, right? And that foreign terrorist organization, which took over real physical territory in Syria and in Iraq, they did it based on a lot of disinformation, a lot of lies, a lot of use of online platforms, social media to recruit, to propagandize, to plot, and to plan. A lot of people lost their lives. A lot of people, got wrapped up in it and convicted. And the question was, what made people vulnerable to those lies? Where was the void in their life? And frankly, ISIS played on our culture wars. They played on things like the war on Islam, to use that as a propaganda technique to drive a wedge between people so that people would have an anti-government sentiment and be susceptible to this calling to be part of something bigger, to be part of something that was going to bring meaning to their lives. And some people went because they loved the idea of Sharia law in the gentle form, where it was projected that we're going to have this utopian state with medical care and education, et cetera. Some people went because they liked the violence, they liked the beheadings, they liked the horrendous nature. They had a little something for everything, but it was all built on a stack of lies. And what I see, the parallels in the way disinformation is used to recruit, propagandize people in this country to, again, get into that corner, play on those culture wars. It's very zero-sum. With racial justice, the idea was if more efforts to create an equal playing field take place, that must mean I'm going to lose something, right? There was never, so much of what we've seen in the polarization is, if somebody else gets something better, that must mean I'm going to be I'm going to be losing. Everything's zero-sum. And economists debunk that, right? The more that we create jobs and opportunity and education and access to housing and access to finance, there's just no question by the data and the statistics, and I'm not an economist, but there's really no question that it makes for a better life for all. But that is just not what the popular belief is. Everything right now is an us versus them. And so that, to me, goes way beyond Washington. When I was in government, we used to talk about using all of our tools, all of government's tools to combat the terrorist threat. But now I realize it's not, and this goes to Jonathan's ending point, I think, too. Government cannot fix this, right? We need all of society's tools. We need, as Jonathan said, individuals to realize their own role in this, to use some, digital hygiene when it comes to choosing your sources of information. But we need the corporate sector. We need the financial sector. We need the education sector. We need media to not become mouthpieces for political parties. We need the technology companies to take responsibility, right? It's all got to be part of a package. And, it's hard to see right now where every day it seems like every issue that ought to be nonpartisan becomes partisan, becomes us versus them, and it starts to get hard to see how to get out of that. And anytime you go to a forum, a smaller forum, and you talk to people of different parties, you can find commonalities. So the question is, how do you scale that? And I think we have to always be careful, and I have to check myself on this, to not cast a net too broadly about, who's bad and who's good, because it just backs people into a corner, and there's no bad or good. It's just like well, there is bad and good. There is evil, that's for sure. But there's a lot of good people, I think, who want to try to fix this. And the question is, how do we get at the roots of that?
I want to follow up on that if I could. I was a diplomat for about half my career in government. And what I saw again and again is conflict would break out when everybody felt like an oppressed minority. I've got some power now, but if the majority gets to take over, I'll be an oppressed minority. So I have to do everything possible to hold on to power. Those are the situations in which the worst governments wind up maintaining control, because they know if they're going to lose it, it's over for them. We've entered a period in our country, and a number of other countries have the same problem, where everybody feels like an oppressed minority. White guys, an oppressed minority. They're not a majority of the country, and they're oppressed by this, that, and the other thing. People of color, oppressed. You name your category, you can come up with it, I am oppressed, and a legitimate rationale for it. And if you take that as a core element of who you are that overrides everything else, you've replaced democratic, melting pot, inclusive society with warring tribes, each competing to try and take over because they don't control things. They'll never get it back. This is happening all over the world. It's incredibly dangerous. And I never expected it to happen in the United States, but it's a core element of what's happened, is everybody's an oppressed minority, which is why I go to coming up with a divide the pot in which the person who's doing the dividing, or the people doing the dividing, are the ones who are going to get taken care of last. If you keep that principle in mind, it at least becomes a means for developing fairer congressional districts, reducing gerrymandering, coming up with more democratic politics and governance, which is good for everybody, which gets to Mary's economic point.
Thank you for your excellent presentations. It's very informative. There certainly was not a lack of imagination for all of those players that tried to overturn the table on everybody. So what is being done now to improve the system or to correct loopholes or whatever that were being attempted to get around the system to overcome all of these errors, understanding that the Constitution does give the power to the states to come up with the electors? But is there anything being done, or what do you think should be done to correct some of these loopholes?
So I suspect both of these folks are well versed in what I'm about to say, but I'll at least introduce it. So my father was governor when 3 Mile Island happened, you may remember. And that was on day 72 of his first term. He thought he was putting a budget together, only to find out that he had to deal with the worst nuclear accident in world history. And his lesson from that was you have to always reserve some room for expecting the unexpected. And in this context, and this is where I'll kick it to these two, I think all kinds of exercises that tries to anticipate what seems unlikely and to try to figure out how you would respond. I mean, this is role-playing and sort of tabletop exercises that military folks do and all kinds of crisis response folks do. And down to the level of citizens seems to me like a really important kind of idea that we ought to get ready for, because maybe the lesson here is what seemed unimaginable and unexpected, i.e., storming the Capitol, is now in the realm of the possible because we've seen it. So we have no excuse for being surprised, at least by that kind of thing, next time around. But
I want to say only one thing, and I want to turn to you, Mary, on the legislation aspect. Assuming that nothing happens, we have a substantial risk in 2024 of having the presidential vote determined by the House of Representatives, state by state, under the 12th Amendment, where whoever has a majority of the 50 states plus DC, probably, 26, decides the presidency. Because under the 12th Amendment, it doesn't take very many people to object. And if you wind up in a situation where there's a contested, the House and the Senate don't agree on who's been elected, that's where you wind up. And there's a substantial risk of that happening. And the best protection against that is for lots and lots of people to vote, and for turnout to be such that it's going to be very, very hard to take the vote away from whoever has been popularly elected within the Electoral College system. And with that, I want to turn to Mary on what's happened in 2021 and what it presages for 2024?
Yes, I think there's a number of different things. No one is perfect. You know, some of the legislation that we've seen is being challenged, and certainly if the bill in Arizona that I referenced that would allow the state legislature to overrule the popular vote after the fact, if that bill were passed, it would be challenged immediately. And notwithstanding that the Constitution gives the state legislature the authority to choose the manner of choosing electors, I think there's a very good constitutional due process argument that once they have decided, whatever they decide, they need to decide before the election. But if before the election, the state legislature, as all 50 states have done, has said the electoral slate will be based on the popular vote of the state, then you can't change it after the election without that violating due process. I think an effort to do that would fail on due process grounds and would be challenged immediately. And there are other challenges, right? We have litigation ongoing, including by the Department of Justice in Georgia and elsewhere. So litigation is one thing. Reforming different pieces of federal legislation like the Electoral Count Act, what Jonathan was talking about, the 12th Amendment, is essentially what comes into play when all of the efforts to resolve through the Electoral Count Act to resolve which slates are the accepted and certified slates from the states, when those fail, then it gets kicked to the 12th Amendment, and as Jonathan said, it's 2 votes per state, and you know, or 1 vote per state, and you know, that's really just going to end up going to, are there more Republican states than Democrat states, or more Democratic states than Republican states? Nobody wants that to be the end result. So the Electoral Count Act, which is an incredibly confusing piece of legislation that was passed after the contested election in 1876 between Hayes and Tilden after the Civil War, this was passed to resolve some of the problems that arose there when there was a dispute over the electoral slates. And the idea of it is to create a mechanism so that when there are real objections to a slate of electors, that each house discusses those, decides which slate is valid, and moves on from there. The problem is it's never really been tested. It's extremely confusing, almost inscrutable, and I was part of a bipartisan task force last year that spent months just being able to put out a document to try to explain how it works. That's how confusing it is. So there's efforts afoot right now to reform that, make it clearer, make it more understandable, make it more workable, and make it less likely to result in things getting tossed to the 12th Amendment. That's out there. Reforms to the Presidential Transition Act, so you can't have a GSA administrator under directions of a president who's denying that he lost say, don't ascertain the election and don't allow the transition to start. I mean, I can't even express to you, because we've kind of forgotten about it now, like how significant that was, that the Biden transition team could not get in offices. They could not get access to information. They could not even begin the transition. Fix that. You know, one of the issues that I think is the most frustrating, that I think the first person who asked a question asked, is it seems weird that somebody who engages in this type of fraud, like being a fraudulent elector, could even be qualified to run for office. But right now, you know, in most states, qualifications are, you know, about age and being a resident and not having a conviction. And there's good reason for that, because who would decide whether the person committed fraud or not? But you know, that's one reason that I come back to the accountability point, right? To the extent that there are mechanisms for holding people accountable, that at least gives something provable to perhaps eventually be a means of disqualifying people from running for office. And I will say there is a provision in the Constitution that says if you commit an insurrection, you're disqualified from holding federal office. Now, there's no implementing legislation, so we don't know who decides if you committed an insurrection, but that exists in the Constitution. So, you know, there's no one set of things that's going to fix it all, but there are a variety of attacks and there are a variety of challenges that can be tried for some of the things.
Is there anything going to be done of the role of the vice president? There was some, I thought I saw or read something where there was an effort to clarify the role of the vice president during the count of the electors.
This is part of the Electoral Count Act fix that's under discussion, bipartisan discussion, right now in particular in the Senate. It's both sides, but it's bipartisan in the Senate, which is where the action is. My judgment is it's not going to happen, that there isn't going to be federal legislation of any kind in this space because partisan passions are running so high. I certainly wish to be wrong.
Before we give it to a member of the community, do any students have a question? Yeah.
And we have time for 2 more questions.
Thank you, guys. Oh.
We can hear you.
Okay. Thank you guys so much for coming out. The first election I could vote in was the 2020 election, and I did. I've always tried to stay up to date on current events, but I'm just getting to the age where I can conceptualize what they mean and the impacts. I'm not at the age yet where I can hold public office or run a task force, but I do want to get more involved. Do you have any advice for people in my position who want to have a greater impact on maintaining a safe and fair democracy, but can't do any of the big jobs yet?
Mm-hmm. Hey, here's a special offer for you. I just got, so I hope this doesn't cause a problem, but I'm teaching a class at Franklin and Marshall down the way there, so don't hate me. But I literally just got something today that is by a group called the Public Citizen, I think. It's like a fellowship for college students to work on strengthening democracy. So if I can find it on email, maybe I'll share it with, I can share it with you if you want to come see me afterwards. But there are a bunch of things like that, by the way. I mean, there's lots of burgeoning opportunities for young folks to pitch in. Some of them, real straightforward and fundamental, like, oh, make sure your friends are all registered to vote, and others, sort of up the ladder from there.
And there are organizations, obviously there's Democratic Party, Republican Party, but there are also just, organizations like League of Women Voters, Fair Fight, which is Stacey Abrams' organization, that are just trying to get people, they have a particular leaning, but they're trying to make sure people understand their right to vote, understand the issues that are, significant in any given election, work to ensure access to the ballots and all that kind of thing. And then there's always, David mentioned, the Get Out the Vote effort. There's volunteering to be poll workers, which you can learn a lot from that. So there's usually a lot. If you're aligned with one party or another, you can first seek out your local party for what opportunities they have, and they might send you to other opportunities as well. But there is a lot of opportunity for. My husband, who retired in 2020, he did a bunch of volunteer work last year and found it very meaningful. So.
We have time for one more question.
Hi, thank you. Like everybody else has been saying, it's been very good to hear your thoughts. One question I have is, what mischief do we think the folks might be doing at the local county level that Steve Bannon is trying to get placed there? And what can we do to arrest that mischief?
Volunteer or run for those elected, those positions. Yeah. Historically, as David said, at all levels, election officials, county election boards, secretaries of state, even though they sometimes have a party label, I think have not really been thought of as partisan jobs. They're just part of good government and making sure government works, and they just do their job, and mostly we take them for granted historically. But this past election showed that those jobs are the ones responsible for ensuring the integrity of the count. And when subject to threats and coercion and disinformation, some of them will cave. And so, that's why the scary thing to me is that people are being frightened out of those jobs because of threats and coercion, and there's this concerted effort, and Bannon has been very public about it, to fill those positions with election deniers. And so and what I haven't seen yet is a well-orchestrated counter effort to say, no, we're going to have, I don't care what party, or no party, people who believe in the integrity of counting the votes and certifying the true electors are the ones who should be in there, not people who are still, over a year later, claiming that the previous election was fraudulent. And so in some of these are elected positions, some I think are just almost volunteer positions. So just get out there and volunteer or run. Or sponsor others to run. And I know that's a hard thing to say when these are people who've become sometimes threatened. I will say there are efforts afoot to provide, in fact, I'm going to a conference in 2 weeks of a bunch of us who are working on efforts to provide more support for election officials, not only enhancing the threats, the current, it's a crime always to threaten anyone, but enhance the penalties for those who threaten election officials, but other things too, like providing protection for them, providing security services if that's what's needed, and providing all that kind of support and education. So I would never thought I had to say, I would have never thought you had to be worried to be an election official, and I hate to even think that's where we are, but we need more people to go out in numbers and say, we will take these jobs, because they're so critical.
I think I have this right, but each and every election in Pennsylvania requires about 44,000 poll workers across the state, right? And if you don't, and if good people don't show up, or then the whole system falls apart. So that is literally like the foot soldiers of democracy that keeps this thing together. And I came to the conclusion in 2020 that you should have no right to weigh in on the inadequacies of the election process if you've never done time as a poll worker.
Yeah, so true.
And I did my couple of years. It's a long, tedious job marked by some really consequential decisions. So if you want to start there, that's a good place to start. There you go.
Yeah. Well, I think you have everything from, people challenging poll workers and others who will come, poll watchers who will challenge without basis, in order to challenge voters' qualifications in order to intimidate. I mean, we've seen that, we saw that this last election. I think we'll see some of that again, put up and sponsored by those who just want to deprive the vote to people who they think are going to vote for the other candidate. And I think we're also going to see, in particular, my concern is that those, not at the poll watching or the poll worker level, but at the county level where they're counting the votes, that's where we saw the incredible pressure last time to just, not certify the election and claim things that were fraudulent. And we saw observers who were, raising objections to just about everything, even things that were completely frivolous. And I remember, David, when you and I did a panel before the election, one of the things we talked about is put a camera in that vote room and let everybody watch exactly what's happening by camera, and you'll see how just, legitimate and boring it is. But it was because of the pressure and because, armed mobs came to some of the places where votes were being counted and yelled and screamed about, let us in and let us see, everything, the stress just went up so much, and that's what I'm afraid of happening again. Which is also why we need more robust enforcement of, existing prohibitions on, use of force by those without authority, armed individuals in sensitive places like polling places and places where votes are being counted, and certainly against unlawful militias.
It's also a reason to have a voting by mail and to have it extend over a long period, because it reduces the pressure on election day.
And counting beforehand, I mean, that's another issue.
Pennsylvania.
Because, right, we had many states have said you cannot even start counting until election day. Well, then we know what happened. It means you don't have the results on election night. You don't have them the next day. It takes several days, and then you have, those like Trump saying that's fraud, it's fraud. We're getting ballots dumped in the middle of the night. We're getting ballots counted 3 and 4 times. We're getting dead people voting. None of that had any legs. None of that was true. But, that some of those rules about not even starting to count until election day fed right into those lies and that narrative. So,
just one quick note in hopes that it's reassuring. We've been here before. Go back to elections, particularly in big cities in the early 1900s. They were basically drunken brawls with I kid you not, with like drunken gangs, roaming the streets, either beating people up because they were at the polls or beating them up to keep them away from the polls. And Jonathan made this point, great point. There was a conscious effort on the behalf of civil society and people of goodwill and integrity in their communities to say, we got to stop this. So a series of reforms were instituted to literally quiet the election process. So again, I don't know if that's reassuring or alarming, but it's worth knowing.
they didn't have AR-15s back then.
Well, that's true.
This concludes tonight's presentation. Please join me in thanking our speakers.
Can you hear me? It's on, okay. I just wanted to respond to the question from the student about what they can do. We do have something called the New Pennsylvania Project, which is devoted to voting. And actually the executive director is a woman named Kadita Kenner, who is supposed to be our Stacey Abrams. And I would encourage you to, check that out online and see if you can plug in with them. The New Pennsylvania Project.